Nice and loud, nice and clear. So, all right. So we're in the book of First Chronicles. We've been going through the genealogies, and we're going to finish that up. We're going to talk very briefly about some of the items there, and then we're going to look at one genealogy in particular, a family line, and then we're going to jump into chapter 10, and we'll continue from that point. So, if you look at First Chronicles, the summary of First Chronicles, you've got chapters 1 through 9 dealing with the genealogies. And then, does everyone have a handout? One, front and back. Should be front and back. Yep. We're on the page 1 of 2, that side. So chapters 1 through 9 deals with the genealogy, and then the rest of the book, we have David as king. So in chapters 10 through 21, this is the history, sort of David's, his reign as king. It doesn't include everything. There are more stories back in the book of 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel that we could look at. And then 22 through the end of the chapter, that deals with David's preparations for building the temple. So he's going to gather everything. He's going to appoint positions in the temple, and then Solomon, his son, will build the temple. And that's when we get into 2 Chronicles. So, but looking at, I may not have this on. Yeah. Yeah, that on button works really well. So, just looking at this, so we finished chapter 6 last week, and we talked about the descendants of Levi. We talked about the priests, the Levites, and their descendants, the locations, the cities that they dwelt in, some of the tasks that they had in regards to the temple. And then we finished that up. We looked at the descendants of Aaron, and then getting into chapter 7, you can see just kind of a summary here up on the screen where, we see the descendants of Issachar, and all of these are the descendants or the sons of Jacob or Israel. And so we see Issachar, one of Jacob's sons, his descendants in chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. Also in chapter 7, I think those first 5 or 6 are all in chapter 7, but we see Issachar, we see Benjamin, Naphtali, West Manasseh. Manasseh was a son of Joseph, and so you had an east and a west, one on one side of the Jordan River, one on the other. We had Ephraim, who was also a son of Joseph. Remember, Joseph's portion went to his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Also, we have Asher, who is a son of Jacob. And then we have Benjamin again, so we have the genealogy of Benjamin a little bit more in detail in chapter 8, verses 1 through 40. And then they're starting in chapter 9, just the first couple of verses. I'd like to read that. Because when we've gone through and we've looked at this genealogy, we've gone back to the book of Genesis and the previous books, and we've kind of looked at, okay, let's see what happened here, and picked up some more information. And so we've been going back and forth. There in chapter 9, verses 1, I think it's the first 2 verses, it says, "So all Israel was recorded by genealogies, and indeed they were inscribed in the book of the kings of Israel. But Judah was carried away captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness." This is their worshiping idols, sacrificing their children to these idols, disobedience to God. And God sent them away into captivity. Babylonian captivity, that lasted from around 606 BC all the way through 536. 536 is whenever they return. So in verse 2, it says, so they've gone into Babylonian captivity around 586. All of them were carried away. And then in verse 2 it says, "And the first inhabitants who dwelt in their possessions in their cities were Israelites, priests, Levites, and the Nethinim." And so chapter 9 goes through and it tells us those that have returned, specifically those of, if you look at verse 10, of the priests. Verse 14, of the Levites. Verse 17, and the gatekeepers. And then in verse 28, now some of them were in charge of the serving vessels. So we see specifically the ones that have come back from captivity and are living here in Jerusalem. What's the significance of these specific people? What is it the Levites, the priests, are able to do? They're able to offer the sacrifices.
They were all temple servants.
Yeah, temple servants, the Nethinim, yep. Yep, exactly. Yep. And as far as the priests, this was the direct descendants of Aaron. Yep. And so they were able to, of course, they had to rebuild the temple when they came back. We see that in the book of Ezra. But they rebuilt the temple, and then these were the ones that would serve in that new temple. And then we get down to verse 35 of chapter 9. And we get into a different genealogy, and it says that this is, I've just labeled this as Saul, but it says it's the family of King Saul. So this is sort of, and Saul descended from Benjamin. He was a Benjamite. And so we see some of his family there. And looking down in verse 39, it says, Ner begot Kish, Kish begot Saul, and Saul begot Jonathan, Malchishua, Amminadab, and Eshbal. So Eshbal, he's called a different name in 2 Samuel, I believe, chapter 2. This was Ishbosheth. This was one of the sons of Saul as well. So we see Saul had 4 sons here, which is a good lead-in to chapter 10. So we look at some of the descendants, Saul's family, and then we're leading into chapter 10. And so it's kind of interesting because, all right, we've looked at the genealogy, we've looked at, we've kind of reminisced a little bit about, okay, the history of Israel and stuff from these genealogies. And then when we get into chapter 10, this is kind of where we're starting to pick up. And then we'll follow the chronological history all the way up through David's death at the end of 1 Chronicles. But the thing that I noticed first about this, it's like, okay, let's start talking about it. Let's pick up at this point. If you look at the first verse, what are they in the middle of? Very first verse. They're in the middle of a war. Yeah. And so I like to think of this as, have you ever watched a movie and as soon as the movie opens up, boom, they're right in the middle of a war. There's all this action going on, and it's kind of exciting and nerve-wracking and things of that at the same time. So that's kind of what I thought when I read this. So we're opening up at a point in history where Israel is in the middle of a war. And so this chapter 10 deals with the death of Saul. So Saul was, we like to think of him as the first king of Israel, which Mike and I were talking. Is Mike in here? There he is. Yeah, we were talking probably, was it about a month ago? And we're back over at the Lehman building where if you look back at Judges chapter 9, Abimelech, which was Gideon's son, was one of the first ones to proclaim himself as king. So he proclaimed himself as king at Shechem. And it says that he reigned over Israel for 3 years. And then after he was killed, then it went back to the reign of the judges. So it's kind of interesting point, where he kind of named himself king. But it says that he did reign for 3 years. But we often think of Saul as the first king over the entire kingdom of Israel. And we're sort of at the end of his life. So chapter 10 is pretty much the chapter of 1 Samuel chapter 31 summed up. So it's got fewer verses here, but you can find this same story in 1 Samuel chapter 31. And so I'd like for us to read this whole chapter. I think it's only 13, 15 verses, 14. Okay. All right, and we've divided it up. So in verses 1 through 7, we see where Saul is killed in battle. Him and his sons are killed in battle. So verse 1, it says, Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Aminadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. So he's only got one son remaining now. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was wounded by the archers. And Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died. So Saul and his 3 sons died, and all his house died together. And when all the men of Israel who were there in the valley saw that they had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook their cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So we see the Philistines are falling before the Israelites are falling, being defeated by the Philistines. So from what we've studied before, whenever Israel is being attacked by their enemies and being overcome, what's the main cause of this? What's the main cause of the enemies being able to attack and defeat the Israelites?
Saul's decision to not call upon the Lord.
Right. And specifically is disobedience. So disobedience to God. When they're not doing what God has instructed according to his commandments, then we see this happening. Anything else that anybody sees for this? Any questions or comments? So we see where his sons are killed, he is killed, and then if we look at the next few verses, I've entitled this "The Philistines' Treatment of the Dead." So after Saul and his sons are killed, we see what happens. So in verse 8 it says, "So it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they stripped him and took his head and his armor and sent it throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon." So after Saul and his sons are killed in battle, they come and strip the bodies, they behead them, take their heads and put them in the temple of their gods, the temple of Dagon. 2 Samuel chapter 31 also tells us that they fastened their bodies to the wall of a city there, Beth Shan, I believe. When we look at the first few verses, Saul, asked his armor bearer to kill him because he's wounded, but he's not dead. So imagine what they would have done to him if they would have caught him alive. So that one of the reasons that he had asked them to make sure that he was dead. Verse 11, after this we see some valiant men come and take the bodies and bury them. Verse 11, it says, "And when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose, took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons, and they brought them to Jabesh and buried their bones under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted for 7 days." So it wasn't until this past week, and I've read this I don't know how many times, but it wasn't, I had noticed there's a story in 1 Samuel chapter 11. And I had wondered, why was it the men of Jabesh Gilead had come to take away their bodies, bring them back, and give them a burial and fast for them and lament for them? Any thoughts? Look at 1 Samuel chapter... Sorry? Exactly. 1 Samuel chapter 11. This is the first battle while Saul is king that he goes out to. There is, I'm in 2 Samuel. It doesn't look right. 1 Samuel chapter 11. This is right after Saul had been anointed king. 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, it says, "Then Nahash the Ammonite," so the Ammonites had come up against Jabesh Gilead. "And they came up and they encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, 'Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you.' Now Nahash the Ammonite answered and said, On this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out all your right eyes and bring reproach on all Israel. So the elders of Jabesh said, okay, give us 7 days and we'll send messengers throughout the land of Israel and we'll come back to you. And so when Saul hears this, there in verse 7, he offers there, let's see, where is it? Yeah, and fear of the Lord came upon the people, and they came out with one consent. He numbered them in Bezek, and the children of Israel 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000, and they came to the messengers. And thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you shall have help. So they travel all night, they get to Jabesh, and then they're able to save the men of Jabesh Gilead. So I believe this is the reason that they had come and taken away the body and buried it, gave it a proper burial. Thoughts? So such a brave thing to do in the midst of what they had to go into to get them. And then in verse 13, I've labeled this as Saul's epitaph. Is that correct? That's the correct word, right? So that's what you put on your tombstone, where that's, the final things that, the last summary of your life kind of summarized. And if you look at that, and it's not good. I wouldn't want this on my epitaph. But in verse 13 it says, So Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance. But he did not inquire of the Lord, therefore he killed him, and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So we see Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he committed against the Lord, and because he consulted a medium. So, if you look at 1 Chronicles, this is kind of a summary. So I think it was Jerome that said this is a divine summary of the entire. I can't remember the exact words, but he said it's kind of like, it's an entire summary of Israel's history. And so 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So when you look at this, and Saul's life is all summarized here in just one chapter, and the main point of it is that he died for his unfaithfulness. And right.
But they did not serve God. Made no pretense to serve God.
Mm-hmm.
But Saul did. The fact that he outwardly made a pretense to serve God, and yet inwardly he didn't follow. That's what he presented. In other words, that's kind of a worse scenario.
Serving God, but wasn't obedient? Is that what you're saying, to the commands, or?
Well, he made a pretense of seeking God and so forth, but then he would go to the mediums, and he would go to he wasn't, he was making a pretense to be a man of God.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't.
Yep.
Some of the terrible kings that were later, the difference is they made no pretense of following God.
Mm-hmm. Just complete rebellion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a difference there.
It-
It's why that he killed him and so forth and so on. It's not going to sit as far as Saul's faith.
Yep. Okay, good. Any other comments? All right, so we talked earlier about, if you look at this, it's kind of a summary, but if we want to look a little bit deeper into all of Saul's reign as king, it's found in 1 Samuel. So I was wanting us to kind of go back through and look, and I've got this sheet here, and I've got some items that are listed in red, which were some of the main items that caused Saul to lose his kingdom and to eventually lose his life in battle against the Philistines. So if you go back to the book of 1 Samuel, let's go through and look at some of these things, because, there's 3 things in particular, but there's a lot more that we could look at. So Let's see if I can find 1 Samuel here. So if you look at 1 Samuel, the first 7 chapters, this is, you can summarize this as I've put Samuel. Let me change the slide here. Okay. So this is Mount Gilboa. I thought this would be interesting. So we've got a map there. You see the Sea of Galilee up in the top right, top left, but of that picture, the top right is the Sea of Galilee, and just to the the south of that, probably midway between the Sea of Galilee and the Jabbok River, you see Mount Gilboa there. So that's where Saul and his sons were killed in battle. And then this is a picture of it at the bottom right. So this looks like summertime here. It's like a pretty neat place there. Okay, so 1 Samuel. So if you divide the book, the first 7 chapters deals with Samuel from his birth all the way through him appointing or anointing Saul and eventually David as king. And then Saul, we see chapters 8 through 15, where chapter 8 he was selected as king, all the way through chapter 15 where he really messes up again in disobeying God's commandments. And then Samuel anoints David as king there in chapter 16. So we see Saul reigning as king by himself in chapters 8 through 15, and then Saul and David together, I guess you're not reigning together, but kind of, at odds, chapter 16 throughout the rest of the book, in chapter 31. First one, so if we look at chapters 8 through 15, we see in chapter 8, Saul is made king of Israel, or chapter 8, this is where the people ask for a king. And then chapter 9, this is where Saul is selected as king. And then we see throughout the next few chapters, all the way through chapter 12, this is where Samuel gives a coronation speech there at his inauguration, I guess you could say. And then in chapter 13, we see an instance here where Saul does something that he shouldn't. So if let's look at chapter 3. So this is the first instance. Up until this point, Saul seems to be a pretty good guy because he's very humble. When Samuel comes to him and says, "I'm going to anoint you as king," and then even when he was going to be recognized in front of the people, he was hiding. It seems like he was very humble. And then also in chapter 11, he saves the men of Jabesh Gilead. When we get over into chapter 13, this is 2 years after he's been reigning as king. In chapter 13, starting in verse 1, I'd like to read some of this. I don't know if we'll read all of it, but it says, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and in the mountains of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent away, every man to himself. And then it talks about where Jonathan had attacked the garrison of the Philistines. The Philistines in verse 5 gathered together to fight against Israel. And so there's this battle going on. And there in verse 7, it says, some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. And as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. They're terrified because they're in battle there. And he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Samuel was supposed to come and offer a sacrifice, but the people start leaving Saul, and so he's afraid that he's probably going to be left there alone. And in verse 9, so Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. And it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might greet him. So who was it that was supposed to offer the offerings, the burnt offering, the peace offerings? It was the priests, right? Saul's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's not a priest. So he gets worried, he takes it upon himself, and he presents the offerings. Verse 11, and Samuel said, what have you done? Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, Then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to him, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his army, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And Samuel rose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people present with him at about 600 men. So Saul here offers these offerings. This is disobedience according to what Samuel has said. So this is one instance, the first instance that we see in 1 Samuel. Because if we look back at 1 Chronicles chapter 10, there toward the end of the verses, it says that he was unfaithful and that he did not keep the commandments of the Lord. I believe, let me go back, just confirm that real quick. Yep, unfaithfulness which he had committed because he did not keep the word of the Lord. Okay. So if we look at the rest of the going on, any questions? Any comments? So if we continue in Saul's reign as king, chapters 13 through 14, we see where Saul continues to have war against some of these other nations, the Ammonites, the Philistines. He's having war here. And then in chapter 15, we see where something else has happened. So this is the next time where we see Saul's disobedience. Starting in chapter 15, let's just read, starting in verse 1. We'll see what this instance, what happens here. We'll get the full story of what's going on here. So Samuel had sent to Saul, and the Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel. Now he ambushed me on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them. But kill both man and woman, infant and nursing, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. That's the commandment. So Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. What was Saul's sin here? What was the disobedient act? Didn't obey what Samuel or what God had told him to do. Verse 10, now the word of the Lord, so this will be the consequences here. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel. Indeed, he set up a monument for himself, and he has gone around, passed by, and came down to Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Saul and said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. He thinks, I guess you could say, he has obeyed the commandment of the Lord. But Samuel said, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, They have been brought from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord has said to me last night." He said to him, "Speak on." So Samuel said, "When you were little in your own eyes, and when you were head of the tribes of Israel, and did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord has sent you on a mission, and said, 'Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" And Saul said to Samuel, "But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites." But the people took the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to go sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. It seems to me like he's kind of pointing the blame at the rest of the people. There, he said, I have obeyed, but the people took these things. But he was the commander, and he should have directed and made sure that God's commandments were carried out, or his command. So Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king." One of the other instances. For the sake of time, we'll go and we'll skip through here. I think we've got about 10 minutes. So we see this other instance of his disobedience, and God has said, "Okay, I've rejected you as being king." Not a very good thing, because, there in verse 11, back in 15, it says, "I greatly regret that I've set up Saul as king." This is God speaking about Saul. And then also, if we look at verses 22 through 23, obedience is important. It says, to obey is better than sacrifice. Sacrifice, that form of worship there, and to heed than the fat of rams. So obedience is, obedience to God and his commandments. It seems like that's the top thing that we should be focused on, obeying God and what his commandments are to the best of our ability. And I think Saul knew that. I have obeyed, but, he didn't utterly destroy, And so that was Samuel there trying to convince him of that. If we go through, so in chapter 16, David is anointed as king. In chapter 17, we see where David defeats Goliath. Chapter 18, we see where the women were singing the song. They were ascribing Saul as killing his thousands. There in chapter 18, verse 7, David his 10,000s. This upset Saul. He was very angry, and he eyed David from that point on. And chapters 18 all the way through pretty much the rest of the book, Saul is trying to kill David, I guess you could say. We can look and see, there's a few verses here. So if we look at this second page here, it's kind of summary of kind of what we were talking about. But there it says Saul tries to kill David. And there are at least 4 different ways that he's trying to kill Saul, or Saul is trying to kill David. So there were 2 instances where he tried to pin him to the wall with a spear, tried to run him through with a spear. There in chapter 20, verses 32 and 33, there's a spear that Saul has that is meant for David, but Saul is so furious that he actually throws it at his own son. He throws it at Jonathan. But Jonathan knew, okay, that was meant for David. I guess one good thing, I guess Saul wasn't the greatest king, but he wasn't the greatest shot either, was he? Which was a benefit for David and Jonathan. So, also, Saul gives his daughter to David as wife in hopes that she will be a snare to him and the Philistines would be able to defeat him because of that. He tries to kill David with the Philistines, there in chapter 18, verse 25. And then also there are messengers. So there are messengers that are sent to Saul's daughters and David's place, I guess you could say, with the intent for them to bring him so that they can kill him. So throughout the book, we see that happening. Also in chapter 22, we see where, David has fled from Saul. So he's kind of on the run. So pretty much chapters 20, 21, all the way through the rest of the book, David is on the run. He eventually has to go into the land of the Philistines before Saul will stop following him. But there in chapter 22, when David goes, David had gone to the priest there at Nob, and Saul had found out about that. Well, later on, Saul goes to Nob there and ends up killing all of the priests, or has them killed. Well, we already know he's not good at it himself, so he has to have somebody else to do it. So he has one of the men there kill the priest there, and not only the priest, but all of their family as well. And then, let's see, we see in chapter 28, this is where Saul consults the medium. So over in chapter 28, so we see all these things that he has done. And then in chapter 28, we see where he's at war, at battle with the Philistines again. And he's nervous, he's scared. Back in chapter 25, Samuel has passed. Samuel died back in chapter 25. And then starting in chapter 28, it also talks about, there in verse 33, it says, "Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented for him and buried him in Ramoth in his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land," which was a good thing, because if we go back and look in Leviticus chapter 20, we're not going to go to these for the sake of time, but you can look through these at your convenience. Leviticus chapter 20 tells that anyone that consults a medium, those that conjure the dead or fortune tellers or those people, they're to be put to death, because it says that it's kind of a form of adultery, I guess you could say, because they're depending on and going to this person rather than seeking guidance from God. And then also in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27, it says those that are spiritists or those people should be put to death. And then it kind of goes through and it talks a little bit about that in Deuteronomy chapter 18 as well. But one interesting thing, so Saul goes to this medium at Endor and asks her to conjure up someone, whoever he asked. And he asked to conjure up Samuel. And there in verse 11, that's where it says, "Then the woman said, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' And he said, 'Bring up Samuel for me.' And so when the woman saw, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, 'Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul.' Anyway, this is Samuel that has come back. In verse 15, Samuel says to Saul, 'Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?' And Saul answered, 'I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me, and does not answer me any more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do.' And then Samuel says, 'Why do you ask me, seeing that the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines.' And some very bad news. 'And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines.' Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground and was dreadfully afraid because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day or all night." What's the message that he gives Saul? You're going to be killed in battle tomorrow. He said, "You're going to be with me." Samuel is dead. So, yeah, it's kind of I guess you could say gut-wrenching, to hear some news like that. Oh, by the way, you're going to get killed tomorrow. So he knows the end is coming. And that, that kind of, it's kind of the story behind, what we see in 1 Chronicles chapter 10. 1 Chronicles chapter 10, we only see a summary. We always see, okay, he was unfaithful, but was it really that bad? But when you go back and you look at through the book of 1 Samuel and see kind of the things that he had done as far as just blatantly disobeying God's commandments and, trying to kill David and killing the priests and consulting a medium, I guess it's a medium, which was blatantly against what God had commanded. We see that in Leviticus chapter, we said Leviticus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 18. It says that person was to be put to death. And so we see that happening. And we see in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, there at the end, where it says that the Lord had him killed, but he did it with the hand of the Philistines. So several times where God has done that with the hand of an enemy, where they would come in and attack them. So, questions? Yeah, I think that the biggest takeaway from my side is the Lord commands obedience, and we should be to put our best foot forward, I guess you could say 110% in obeying whatever the commandments of God is, because that's serious business, and we see that here with the life of Saul. All right. Exactly. Partial obedience is still disobedience. And it's interesting also because, Saul went to offer the sacrifice. The thought was there, but he wasn't worshiping in the way that God had commanded. Yeah. We have to worship in spirit and in truth. Yeah, exactly. Other comments? All right. Thanks a lot. Y'all have a good evening.